Hi everyone. Here's something a little different from what I've been doing. If you don't know, professionally, I'm a musician who's been dabbling, I guess a little bit more than just dabbling, but been dabbling in podcasting. I've been a long-time listener of podcasts since 2007. And even though this medium has been around solidly for about 10 years, I'm kind of amazed at how few people listen to podcasts in relation to the rest of the population that don't. And it's also notable how few podcasts I really connect with, which is about 10. And yet, there's probably 1,000 podcasts out there now. There's a great podcast on historical topics out there called Hardcore History. I've been a long-time listener of that one. And it's by far my favorite podcast ever created to date. And there's also a newer one called History on Fire. The difference between those and what you're about to hear is that I'm not as learned about orating and history as Dan Carlin, the host of Hardcore History, and Daniele Bolelli, the host of History on Fire. Like I mentioned, I'm a musician, but what distinguishes this episode from any other podcast I've personally heard is that I scored a soundtrack to it. Maybe I'll add being a podcast soundtrack maker to my area of expertise. Something else that's different about this episode is that it's the first one where I'll mention that I have a quote-unquote tip jar at my podcast site. If you like what you hear, consider dropping $1 or more if you want in it. It's at atlanticradio.blogspot.com. Also, if you plan on buying anything from Amazon, consider buying it through my podcast site I just mentioned, as they'll give me a kickback just for you doing that. I hope you enjoy this.
The Umbrella Corporation. Our business is life itself. This podcast episode is brought to you by nothing.
Try it for free.
On an average day, if you're going to the grocery store, you get in your car and realize you left your cell phone in your home. Do you go back and get it? Ideally, you'd think that you'd just drive off. The store is just a few minutes away. But realistically, most people I know, including myself, would go back and get it. I never felt as attached to my cell phone as I feel now until I had kids. In a way, love is driving our dependence on technology companies. But if you were going on a road trip, say something short like 40 miles, you'd definitely take your cell phone with you, right? And if you were going to travel across your state, say 200 miles, it's a certainty that you'd take it with you then, right? I mean, who knows what may happen? You may get lost and need your GPS. You may break down on the interstate. You might need to call a tow truck. With a cell phone, solving any of these problems is quite easy. Now, imagine you have your cell phone. Let's say it's one of the nicer ones out there. But none of the cell phone towers work anymore. And there's no satellite to help navigate you. And instead of a road trip, you're going on a ship. It's a big ship with an intricate array of sails. And where are you going? You're going to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, say about 3,000 miles into the sea. all without the technology that you're accustomed of relying on. Now, I don't know about you, but the thought of doing that is pretty fucking scary to me. And it's fascinating that that's what people did for centuries. And there were whole communities, towns, and in this case, a whole island, for whom seafaring was a way of life. If you would have asked me just a few weeks ago where Nantucket is, I would have said to you, isn't that in some American folk song? Or that it brings up images of men wearing shoes with buckles on them and white stockings for socks and those dangly bow tie things. And the reason Nantucket's important to this story is that that's where the whaling ship, the Essex, comes from. And we're talking about a time around the 1820s. Now, I had no idea what whaling was all about, and I had no idea how much a large part of the world depended on whale oil. It's how people kept the lamps in their cities lit up. And I think more recently it's been used for lipstick. But around the 1820s, it was a big part of people's lives. Far more than what it is today. And something else I didn't know was just how gruesome the job of whaling was. And maybe still is. I don't even know if it still goes on anymore. Our story is about a whaling ship named the Essex. And it set out to sea with a crew of 20 men. Their job was to hunt down enough whales to fill the hundreds of empty barrels in their ship's stockhold with whale oil. And when these whale hunters actually went in pursuit of a whale, they had to get off of their main vessel and get onto much smaller boats. Boats that look like lifeboats. Their main vessel is one of those big, majestic-looking ships with a bunch of sails on them, like 16 sails or more. So this wasn't some boat we're talking about here. Their main vessel was a real ship. This is a ship bigger than any bus or 18-wheeler. It's more like the length of something like 3 18-wheelers. So these men would lower themselves down on these smaller whaling boats that are about the length of 2 Volkswagen Jettas. So a crew of 3 boats would get into the water and row towards the whale that they spotted. And the more experienced whalemen on the boats knew when the whale would submerge itself into the water, they knew where it was going to come up. So they judge its trajectory and then paddle to where it would surface. And then when the whale would surface, they'd take this harpoon, which they held in their hand, and they'd stab the whale. They'd plunge the harpoon into the whale's back. And they'd look for this area that would incapacitate the whale. And there was blood everywhere. And the whale would start to spew blood out of its breathing hole up top. So it would shoot out parts of its insides and salt water. It was gory. Upon learning this, I couldn't help but feel sorry for the whale. Because basically it was choking on its own blood. And you know, it's just a whale. It's a sperm whale. It's not doing anything to anyone. Unless you're one of the squids that they eat. And if the whale was fighting back too hard, the men would start hacking at the whale's tail. because in its struggle, the whale's tail alone could knock the boats over. Today, we think of whales as gentle giants, things that most people wouldn't ever want to harm. I know I wouldn't want to do this job. So these were hardened men. These were men who were desensitized to the feelings of the whale. And it was a different time back then. So after repeatedly stabbing the whale, and the men being drenched in blood and pieces of flesh that the whale would keep shooting up into the air, and the water all around them would be red with blood. Eventually, the whale would die, not knowing what the hell happened to it, probably. Then they'd tug this poor whale back to the ship, where they would butcher it. And it wasn't like butchering a fish, because these are mammals we're talking about. These are warm-blooded animals we're talking about. There was a case more recently in the 1990s where a whale washed up on the shores of Nantucket, the same exact island that the men on this ship of the 1920s were from. And to show you how times have changed, there was a whole team there trying to save the whale, trying to get it back into the ocean. And they would cheer it on after succeeding to get the whale back in the water. But the whale washed back up on another beach again, on the same island. Eventually the whale died. It turned out that it had broken ribs and lacerations around its head. They don't know if it hit a boat or a ship or if it got into a fight with another whale. But one of the men on this rescue team, after about a day of the whale laying dead on the beach, they decided to keep the bones of the whale for Nantucket's Whaling Museum. It's already dead. I don't see anything wrong with that. But this man who climbed up on top of the whale stabbed the whale, and the whale had filled up with gas. It was decomposing. And the man shot straight up into the air. It just blew him right off the whale with a foul-smelling gas. And the smell was so foul because, again, this is a mammal we're talking about. So I guess it smelled more like dead flesh than dead fish. And they were constantly gagging. The stench was so bad that it made their eyes water as they worked on separating the flesh from the whale's bones. So back to the Essex in the first quarter of the 1800s. So these men would butcher up the whale, actually boil the parts of the whale that they needed on the ship, and then they discard all the parts of the whale that they didn't need overboard. And they did this over and over again until they filled all of the stock holes of the ship. Then the ship would return, and the men would be home for several months. And then they'd do it all over again. And it wasn't just the Essex doing this. There must have been thousands of ships doing this. And if not thousands, then at least hundreds. Well, at least 100 for sure. So if you can imagine, from a bird's eye view, man is wreaking havoc on nature. Because not only are they hunting whales, but when these ships stop at different ports to either repair the ship or to pick up supplies. They also pick up turtles, big turtles, like 200-pound turtles and 150-pound turtles. The men found turtle meat very delicious. I've never had it, but it makes me curious to try it now. Not that I want to eat it really, though. Something about eating turtle meat just grosses me out. And the men would also pick up hogs, and they'd just be running around on the ship. Then the turtles would be sliding around on the ship also. They were kind of like pets, but pets that they were going to eat. So every single ship that's whaling is killing whale after whale. And when they stop places to pick up supplies, the men need to eat, of course. So they also pick up pigs and turtles. And I'm talking about dozens of pigs and dozens of turtles. These men, after all, are going to be at sea for at least a year, but usually 2 years and sometimes 3 years. When learning about this, I often thought to myself, well, why don't they just fish? So today, the whale population, despite all of the whaling that's happened over the course of the past 200 years, their population, the sperm whales population, is at about 1.5 to 2 million. That's a lot of fucking whales. But they were taking hits left and right in the first quarter of the 1800s. If you're worried about them, rest assured there's plenty of sperm whales out there. And after this story of the Essex, it's been rumored that the temperament of sperm whales changed. And this story relating to the Essex and this whale is like a milestone marker of when whalemen and sailors noticed the temperament of sperm whales changing. So these men on the Essex, they were on their ship for months, maybe a year. I don't recall the exact length of time, but they were on their ship long enough to leave Nantucket, which is off the coast of upper North America on the eastern coast, and go all the way down South America around something called Cape Horn, which is really dangerous because apparently there's a bunch of rocks in the water there, mountain ranges maybe, where your ship is liable to sink. So now this is South America. So they came around South America, the bottom of South America, and they started going off into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now it was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean when they were just going along one of their average whaling days, when something unheard of happened. But before I get to that, I'll let you know that shortly after leaving port, the Essex went through a storm that was so bad that it knocked this huge, majestic ship on its side. I don't know about you, but if I'm on a ship that's the size of a passenger jet, and that thing is knocked on its side in the ocean, I'll probably be asking somebody to take me back home. I don't care if they think I'm a pussy or not. It's like I'm done. So what did these men do? So the ship took some damage. It took on some water. And they set sail. All the way down North America and South America, and they went around the Cape Horn, like I mentioned, and into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that thing that I said that was unheard of happened. One of the men on the ship spotted a whale coming at them. And two smaller whaling boat vessels were out in the water hunting whales. about a mile away from the ship. So if you can imagine, you're in the middle of the ocean, there's nothing when you look around you but water and waves. I'm sure it wouldn't be too difficult to spot one of the smaller ships only a mile away. So this whale that became the inspiration for Moby Dick was spotted by one of the men in the crew, and the whale was coming straight for the ship. The guy was like, "What the hell? What the hell is this whale doing? Is it gonna turn?" So right away they scramble, they try to veer this way or that way to try to avoid the whale, to try to avoid the collision. But the whale hits the ship. Bam! And it shakes the boat and knocks some of the men off of their feet. A few of them were certain that their ship took some damage with that hit. And the whale seemed to just wade there beside the ship, as if it was stunned. And they debated whether or not to harpoon it. But they feared that if they harpooned it and didn't kill it, it might cause more damage to the ship. So a little time passed, and the whale came to. And then it started swimming away from the ship. It swam pretty far away, and it turned around, and it started picking up speed and heading straight for the Essex again. A chill of terror ran through the crew. Just imagine, you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 3,000 miles away from land. You know how far 3,000 miles is? That's like from Northeast Florida to San Francisco. Except all that distance is water. So the whale was picking up speed and picking up speed. It was going 8 knots. I don't know, I'm not a sailor, but it was going fast. And bam! It hits the ship again. Almost right away, the men on the ship knew that the ship was done. And if they didn't know it, they certainly had a good idea of it. But it didn't take long, I think an hour, for the ship to start sinking. And by the way, the whale just took off. So I guess the whale didn't have any remorse for these men if it was attacking the ship, if it knew what it was doing. But we'll never know the answer to that question. We don't speak whale, and that whale is long gone. But it isn't unheard of for whales to attack ships. Now, anyway. So the men on the 2 smaller vessels that were out hunting the whales, they look back and they're looking for the ship, and they're having trouble spotting it. Why? Because the ship's filling up with water and it's turning on its side. I can feel myself get apprehensive just talking about this right now. To be in the middle of a vast ocean and to know that your only source of land, of dry land, is sinking rapidly. Of course, if I had time for it, I don't know, I've never been in a situation like that. I don't want to be in one. I might have this undercurrent of a feeling that this was vengeance on part of the whale for the hundreds of whales that have been killed just by the men on the ship alone. So the men on the 2 small whale hunting boats, that's what I'll call them, whale hunting boats. So they start paddling back to the ship. And these boats can paddle pretty quickly because there's 6 men on there and most of them are paddling. Because they see this hump. The ship had turned on its side and they see this hump and they're like, oh, there's the ship. It's sinking. In disbelief. Now these men are realizing that their only source of dry land, of floating dry land, is going to leave them stranded in the middle of the ocean. So they hurry back to the ship. And they get there. And the captain starts calling out orders. And everybody starts brainstorming. And one of the black sailors has the foresight to go down into the captain's quarters that's filling up with water. And he grabs a navigational tool called a quadrant. Actually, he grabs 2 of them. The way they work is, I'm not exactly sure how they work, but you do it at noon and you measure the shadows or something like that, or the position of the sun. And it tells you which way you're heading. Obviously, if you were on the ship with me, you wouldn't hand me the quadrant because I wouldn't be able to tell you which way we're going with it. But where these men are heading right now is down into the ocean. So what would you do? As for me, I don't know. I'd be freaking out in a major way. So they start grabbing the provisions that they can. They start trying to salvage hogs that they have on board, which are really skinny anyway, and turtles. And they start dumping them into the smaller whale hunting boats. And they grab some hardtack, which is like some sort of dry bread. It doesn't sound very desirable to eat. So most of the stuff is getting wet now. And they grab water. Of course they grab water. So they pack these little whale hunting boats with as much water, hardtack, turtles, and hogs as they can. Because they're like 3,000 miles out at sea. And it's 1820. And there's no GPS. And they don't have cell phones. And there's no Coast Guard. Basically, they're completely on their own. So they all hop on these boats. And they don't leave the ship right away. So it turns out that the captain ordered to cut the masts, which are the things that hold the sails. So they cut the masts off. And it makes the ship turn back upright because it was weighing it down to one side. So the ship was still sticking out of the water in a slope, but it kept sinking. And they tried to salvage any other provisions or pieces of wood or fabric or anything else that might be of use to them. They grabbed some nails, some repair nails, and a hammer, and I think a hatchet. And they grabbed pistols. And the captain knew to grab pistols because he knew and he'd heard stories about men who are stuck in the middle of the ocean on these small boats going crazy and trying to raid the provisions. So they would have to assign someone to protect the hardtack and the water because they're going to have to ration it. And you wouldn't believe how little water each man gets every day for a trip of 3,000 miles. So as quickly as they could, they figured and they talked under these panicked conditions about where they're going to go and where they are. So it turns out that they were just hundreds of miles away from islands like Tahiti. But at that time, there were many rumors about these islands having cannibals on them. I don't know about you, but I'd rather face a cannibal than to face a 3,000-mile trip on a boat that's the length of 2 Volkswagen Jettas. So another thing the men did, because they're professionals, unlike me, they cut up some wood and some of the sails, and they made sails on all 3 of the little whale hunting boats. So a day or 2 passed, and they spent the night next to the ship in disbelief, as if refusing to leave their motherland. Maybe viewing it in a way that Native Americans view the earth. Because really, that ship is the only thing that's standing between them and the depths of the cold Pacific Ocean. After some debate, they decided to not go to any of the islands because they were terrified of cannibals and didn't want to be killed and eaten by other men. And they decide that in retrospect, from in hindsight, from my view here, it was a mistake. But I already know how the story plays out, so it's not fair to them. Nonetheless, they decided to head for South America, which was about 3,000 miles away, instead of heading for one of the much closer islands with supposed cannibals on them. So they leave the ship, and then pretty soon, they can't see it anymore, and their home is gone. During the process of leaving their doomed ship, the Essex, with their 3 small whaleboats, grossly overloaded, they decided that they would do everything in their power to keep the 3 boats together. I can easily imagine the desire to want to stay together under such circumstances. Plus, they only had 2 quadrants, those little navigational devices. It was much easier to keep track of one another during the day, but at night, the other boats were difficult to see. So off they went, heading for South America, with their greatest of hopes being that they would be spotted by a ship and rescued. They had to make their provisions last. So each man was allotted 6 ounces of hardtack, which is some sort of bread that is very undesirable to eat. It's like dried or hard or something like that. I imagine it looking like soap from descriptions that I've read. They could also only have a half pint of water a day. That's half of an average beer glass for being under the sun all day when it was sunny out. And this also included the labor that they had to perform: rowing, handling the sail, and bucketing water out of the boat. In spite of being in such a terrifying situation, I wonder if the men on these 3 small whaleboats had any kind of, or if any of them had any kind of consolation at night when they would look up at the stars on a clear night. And to maybe almost be consoled by the immensity of the sky and the multitude of stars. If people feel small looking up at the sky in a place where it's clear and you can see all the stars, if they feel that small, if people feel small on land, imagine how it would feel when you're floating around on a little boat in the middle of the ocean. Not only do you have the immensity of the stars, the sky, but the immensity of the sea all around you. I imagine it would give me a feeling, both a feeling of insignificance, and at the same time, it would give me a strong desire to claim my significance, to survive. The crew of the Essex faced high winds, which weren't always blowing in the direction that they needed them to, sometimes taking them farther away from their destination goal. And this posed to be utterly fatal due to the scarcity of their provisions. They also faced numerous storms. Sometimes the waves would be 30 feet high. If you can imagine a 30-foot high wave and you're in this small boat, that's about, I suppose, the height of a telephone pole. During nights like this, and nights where it was just plain dark, where the moon was a new moon, it was difficult to keep track of each other. And sometimes they'd lose sight of each other's boats, which was utterly alarming to the crew. It's known that when people are in such dire situations as this, sticking together seems, and probably is, all important. And one of the worst fears of every individual in a situation like this is that they'll be the last person left alive. Luckily, they managed to find each other. And there are many other factors that come into play. Things that one wouldn't have any foresight for, things that you have no reason to think of because they haven't happened yet. And you don't have any intellectual tools to have any foresight for them. Like, they started getting sores on their skin due to the salt, the constant exposure to salt. Yet, a peculiar thing is that from day to day, in their day-to-day life, they still did regular things, like they all shaved with a knife daily, well, as long as they could. And one of the crew members started to make a string out of loose pieces of rope. So they tried to hang on to things that gave them a sense of normalcy as much as possible. As time passed, as the days passed, that piece of string and their beards got longer and longer. The man who made it had the idea that if they survived, he would keep it as a memento, as a testament to what they went through. It's safe to say that there were no days of joy when they were virtually lost at sea, but not completely lost, because with the help of the quadrant, at least they knew where they were, even if they couldn't always control where they were heading. It's difficult to picture where one's mind might be, to know that beneath you is an endless sea, and the only thing keeping you from that sea is a small boat that you know can easily fall apart. Those boats aren't designed to be out at sea like that, to face storms day after day, night after night, but to constantly be facing your mortality, to be threatened with your mortality, and to see, hear, and smell that threat anytime you were awake is a harrowing place to be. On one especially bad day, it's hard to pick which day is the worst. Probably the days where someone dies, of course. But concerning the storms, during one especially bad storm, a wave broke over one of the boats and filled it up with water. It caused the men to frantically bail the water out of the boat. And it wet some of their provisions, some of their hardtack, saturating it with salt water. And then when the water would evaporate, it would just leave the salt behind. And if you don't know, when you're dehydrated, to get any more salt into your system could prove deadly. Maddening. But the men still kept the hardtack. I would keep it too. You don't have anything else. Still, one can't help but wonder, why don't they fish, right? Well, they did try fishing, but what are they going to use as bait? One time, there was a school of flying fish that came flying over the boats, and they hit the sails, and some of them fell into the boats. And it was every man for himself concerning the fish. There was no sharing, I guess. But they ate the fish alive because they were starving. Then shortly thereafter, another one of the boats developed a leak. It was so bad that the men couldn't keep up with it, no matter how fast they bailed. But being the experienced seamen that they were, they actually managed to fix the boats while in the water by getting all of the crew to go to one side and making a part of the boat stick up out of the water. Like to go to the back of the boat and making the front of the boat stick up. That's a truly impressive feat and something that shows the drive for survival. The ingenuity that arises in people when they're in situations like this. And these kinds of things just never ended. Maybe there was a day of calm, but that wasn't good either, because that means that there was no wind to take them in the direction that they wanted to go. And they would just wade in the water, knowing that every day that passed was a day of less provisions, a day wasted, not traveling in the direction they needed to go. Then another one of the whale boats, that of the captain's, believe it or not, was attacked by a whale again. But this time, it wasn't a sperm whale that attacked the boat. It was what we call killer whales, or orcas. The whale had managed to bite part of the boat off. And this happened at night. And it was said that the whale was playing with the boat like the way that a cat plays with a mouse that it's caught. It was hitting it with its tail and whatnot. So the men took poles from their makeshift sail and they beat the whale as hard as they could until it left them alone. Remarkably, they managed to repair this boat as well. So all of these things happened, and more. And they were only out away from their mothership 1 week so far. They already started feeling the negative effects of having only 1 pint of water each per day. And such little food, about 500 calories per day. And this is supposed to keep them going with the stresses of being out at sea, having to row, having to sail, navigate, dealing with the sun, the cold, the storms. But they went on their way in their boats, managing to repair them when they needed to, as they needed to, enough to stay afloat. It doesn't really need to be said, but I'll say it anyway. This is a gravely desperate situation. A school of dolphin followed them for a day. From my perspective here on dry land, imagining the playful dolphins and their gray color, their joyful faces, I get feelings of envy for the fish, being in their environment and not in any danger, actually thriving. The crew's hunger was now unbearable, and they tried the best they could to lure one of the dolphins on board. They decided, instead, to eat one of the tortoises. As they butchered the tortoise, they drank its blood, since it contained much-needed nutrients and water. But no matter how much they needed the water and sustenance from it, some of the men couldn't bring themselves to drink the blood of the tortoise. After that, they cooked it in its shell and ate it. Being dehydrated, it must have been difficult to digest the meat. The pressures symbiotically mounted, like falling dominoes, and around the 17th day away from the Essex, they had to endure another raging storm. And they tried to collect water from the sails. They tried to collect the rainwater from the sails. But they found that their sails were permeated with salt, which made the water they collected salty. It's difficult to imagine having enough fresh water with you, enough to satiate you, and having the self-control to not drink it, in spite of feeling such tremendous thirst. Although the crew dreamt of drinking the water, they knew that if they did, they would be satisfied by it now. But in the long run,
It would be a death sentence.
on the 23rd day since leaving the doomed Essex behind, the men had to cut their rations in half, from 6 ounces of hardtack bread to just 3 ounces. But except for the water, a half pint a day was already merely delaying their death. And they soon resorted to drinking their own urine. There are phases to extreme dehydration. First, your saliva becomes pasty and tastes terrible. And then your tongue sticks to your teeth and the roof of your mouth. And speaking becomes just about impossible. And you swallow and swallow because it feels like you have something stuck in your throat. If you want to know what happens next in the process of dehydration, you can look at a story of what happened to a guy named Pablo Valencia, as told by W.J. McGee in 1906. Pablo was a sailor turned prospector, and he got lost in the Arizona desert. A month into having left the Essex, the men had abandoned all hope. But then something amazing happened. One of them spotted land and yelled it out. They were so out of it that they had to check with each other to make sure that they weren't seeing a mirage. After confirming it, they got closer to the island, and they were disheartened because it looked like a big rock just sticking out of the ocean. So they made their way around this cliffside, this stone cliffside, and they actually found a shore. the men would make it to dry land here. I would be ecstatic to have found dry land. And I'd forget about the worries about, is this place livable? Just to be away from the threat of sinking into the ocean for at least a little while. But it turned out that this island was quite sizable. It was a few miles long and a few miles wide. And there were birds and nests that the men found quite easy to hunt and use for food. So for the time being, the problem of food was solved. But there was still the just as paramount problem of water. They spent days looking for a source of water and collecting rainwater from rocks. And they actually found one. They found a spring of fresh water. Right there at that moment, that would have been my new home for maybe forever. I am not getting back in one of those rickety boats and going back into the ocean to trek for 1,000 or 2,000 miles to try to make it to South America. I would have been one of the 3 men that stood behind. They all spent some time recovering, eating, drinking fresh water. But there was a problem with the fresh water, as things always pop up in a crazy kind of way. The spring was too close to the rising tide, and they could only get to the spring at a certain time of the day. So, for the other half of the day, the spring would be covered up by salt water. Nonetheless, the men recuperated substantially, but not nearly to what one would call to a healthy level. The birds on the island, they actually managed to go through and kill most of the birds on the island. And that was a problem. So they'd have to go hunting and foraging deeper and deeper into the island. Another thing they found on the island was a cave. And in that cave were the skeletons of several men, all laying next to each other, as if they just laid down and decided to die. Perhaps these people were not as lucky as they were, and they didn't find any fresh water. But on December 27th, a month after the Essex sank, all but 3 of the men left for South America once again, promising that if they made it ashore, they would do everything in their power to come back and rescue these men. And here's something a little scary that we know now that they didn't know. The island that they thought they were on was not the island that they thought they were on. It was close. But as to their whereabouts, they were mistaken. The men who stayed behind on the island found a large tree. And on that tree was carved the name of a ship, the Elizabeth. That's probably the people who were shipwrecked on that island, the people in the cave. The men who left on the boats for South America pretty soon went through their newly found food provisions. Over the course of several days, they faced squalls, huge waves, and storms. And one of the men on the boats who seemed sickly even before the Essex sank, was starting to succumb, and he asked if he could be moved to the captain's boat, because the captain was on a boat with his own people, which meant they were all from Nantucket. And everybody knew what that meant, that he was preparing to die, and he wanted to go among his kindred. That same day, at 4 p.m., that sailor died, and they brought the 3 boats together. They sewed the man up in his clothes. They tied a stone to his feet, and they let him go into the ocean. Here's what everyone feared. Maybe some of them welcomed it. It's hard to say. But here was the first casualty, and it definitely wouldn't be the last. Because the man who just died was serving as captain of his little boat, and he was sickly, he didn't keep track of the provisions well enough, and they discovered that they were pretty depleted. There was only enough food to last the men on that boat 3 or 4 days. About 50 days after having left the Essex and being out at sea, one of the boats became separated and got lost from the other 2. And even though they agreed that if their boats became separated, they would just keep sailing southeast, they couldn't help but do the best that they could to find it. They were now about a 20-day sail from the island that they had left, and more than 1,000 miles left to go to reach South America. Pretty soon, the men realized that the provisions they had wouldn't last them. So what was once a daily ration of 6 ounces of hardtack bread became 3 ounces of hardtack bread. And they had to cut it again to 1.5 ounces of bread per day. Shortly thereafter, the men in one of the 2 boats that were still together ran out of provisions. So there they were, looking at their empty bread box. So what could the men in the other boat that still had provisions do but to share? Knowing full well that sharing meant that they'd collectively only have a few days of food left. To make matters worse, the seas were calm for days as they lay there under the hot sun and windless. They were now so physically depleted that they reached a point where they were just crawling around at the bottom of the boats and performing what would be the most mundane tasks of any sailing day with the most difficulty. Steering the boat or doing anything with the sails. They could barely stand up. And if they tried to stand up, they would soon fall again. Because of these conditions, one of the men who was serving as the captain of his boat realized that he had left the box unlocked, and one of his mates had stolen some provisions. The anger that ran through the captain gave him enough energy to grab his pistol and threaten the man who had stolen it. The one who had stolen the provisions was the oldest man of the crew, and he gave it back without hesitation. Then another horrendous thing in the series of horrendous things that have been happening so far happened. A shark attacked one of the two boats that were still together. It went after different parts of the boat, but the men didn't have the strength to fight the shark off. Fortunately for them, the shark got bored and went away. On January 20th, 2 months after having left the Essex and being out at sea, one of the men declared that it was his turn to die. Soon after that, he lost his ability to speak. I don't know the science behind this, but it seems that people in these kinds of situations, when they're teetering between life and death, it seems that will is keeping them alive more than anything, more than the tiny amount of water or food that they're eating. Whatever the truth is concerning that, I hope I never have to find out myself. But the man who had proclaimed that it was his turn to die basically laid down at the bottom of the boat and went to sleep forever. And the following morning, his body joined that of the mates who had died recently in the grave of the ocean. Just barely over a week after that, the men in the two boats that were still together were down to a pound of hardtack bread to be split amongst each other. The same day they realized this, another one of the men died. And this is when they started to think about, and having no other real possibility for food, of eating him. Here they were, after having decided to travel about 3,000 miles towards South America in order to avoid the cannibals they heard rumors of on other islands like Tahiti. And now they were facing the possibility and contemplating becoming cannibals themselves. This is one of those situations where people's fear has steered them in the wrong direction. Because the men didn't know that those rumors about the cannibals on those islands were untrue. And here they were, ironically, becoming what they were willing to risk their lives crossing a vast ocean for, which was to avoid being eaten by other humans, or savages, as they would call them. Yet none of that was true. Nonetheless, they decided to eat their deceased fellow shipmate, who had been sailing with them for so long when he was alive. But somebody would have to butcher him. So here's a person that you know, or that you knew. Where do you start? Do you cut off the arm first? Do you cut off the head? Do you start with a leg? Wherever they started, they wound up eating their fellow shipmate. Then, a couple of days later, about 60 days after having left the assuredly now sunken Essex, another one of the men died. And they ate him too. The death and eating of these men isn't without controversy. And I'm not talking about the controversy of being eaten by their fellow shipmates. The first men to die and serve as food were of African descent. It's been proposed that the first men to die and be used as food happened to be of African descent because they have genetically, supposedly, less body fat than those of European descent. That may or may not be true, I don't know. But what I do know is true that at the time that this was taking place, black people were often seen as less human than those of European descent to the Europeans. Meanwhile, this was going on the two ships that were still together, about 100 miles south was the other boat, the boat that got separated. They were sitting under the hot sun in calm seas, meaning no wind in their sails. Because of the sun and the salt air, they started getting huge boils on their skin. And while also their desperate conditions mounted, they hardly had the strength to move around. They hardly had the strength to chew their bread. They grew increasingly delirious. The man that was serving as captain on the lone boat stopped being a harsh captain, and he started acting more as a father figure to his crew. And he was only 23 years old. Right about this time, in just a little over 2 months after having left the Essex, the men of this boat made an observation with their quadrant, and they realized that they were still just under 2,000 miles away from South America, from Chile to be specific, and they encountered a cold storm. Their bodies had trouble enduring this because there was no body fat left. And this would be the first time where it seems that the men of this boat unanimously gave up. They decided to just let the boat go wherever the hell the boat wanted to go. Meanwhile, with the other two boats that were still together, the third black man died and was eaten. So it happened only within 7 days from the first African sailor to die and be eaten to this one. That left only one black sailor left. Regardless of the truth of the matter, how it happened or how it didn't happen, if I was that black sailor, I would be wondering if I was next. Now, concerning the two boats that were still together, they lost sight of each other during the night at about 1,500 miles off of the coast of South America. That's about half the distance across the United States. After having consumed the last of the meat of their deceased fellow shipmates, they decided that it was time to start casting lots. And in case you don't know, casting lots is like when you take matchsticks or pieces of paper and you cut them to different sizes, and whoever gets the shortest stick loses. And one by one, and as time went on, the men on these boats started consuming each other. And notably, one time, this involved an uncle having to partake in consuming his own nephew. So, what about the 3 men that were left on the island? What were they doing? Were they still alive? At this time, we don't know. But for these men on the boats, all their luck had run out. There was no chance that they were going to make it to shore, any of them, alive. Their last hope was to be spotted by a ship. These men were at death's doorstep and were leaning against the door. as what happens to people who are starving to death. They had dreams of feasts, only to be tormented upon waking, to realize they were still in these rickety boats in the middle of the sea. About halfway into the 3rd month of having left the Essex, one of the men started ranting madly and twitching. I don't know who that would be worse for, the man who was going through that or having to see that after all that you've been through so far. The mad ranting sailor then had violent convulsions at the bottom of the boat and died. This man was eaten too. The conditions under the sun and being out at sea, having all these boils and sores on your skin, and your limbs swelling due to starvation, is a highly precarious one, to say the least. Because 3 days or 2 or 1 day too long without food and water can mean that you don't make it out of this alive. Who knows if you even care at this point? Who knows if you care more than you normally would at this point? And after having traveled all this time and endured all these horrors in relation to being so close to making it, well, you get the idea. After having studied this historical topic, I've learned many things about being out at sea. It turns out that when you see a large mass of clouds, that means that there's land nearby. And that's exactly what the remaining men on these boats saw. This meant that they were just a few days, at the most, from land. Along with the hunger and the thirst, the anticipation must have been unbearable. This was the bottom of the 9th, and your favorite team was playing. And the man who had been braiding a piece of twine looked out to scan the horizon, and he said, "There's a sail." Soon all the men were on their feet, feeling who knows what, feeling joy, feeling terror. What if it didn't see them? What if they couldn't catch it? The ship was much bigger than their little boat, with the ability to travel much faster. For the next 3 hours, they did the best that they could to catch up to it or to cut it off, but to somehow get within sight of it. And they got within sight of it enough that they started to see specks of people coming up on deck of the ship. The ship had indeed spotted them. The name of the ship was the Indian, and it was from London. The shipwrecked men of the Essex made it alongside the Indian, but they soon realized that they didn't have the strength to climb aboard. The men of the Indian looked down at the awful sight. Their skeletal bodies, their dark and sunken eyes. The captain of the ship was moved to tears. Some of the men from the Indian went down to the boat and brought the men on board, and the captain had his cook make the men a meal. About 300 miles south of what was happening here, there were still 2 survivors on one of the other whale boats. A dozen days had passed since they had eaten the last unlucky member of that crew. And they had resorted to sucking the marrow out of the bones, which they had now cracked open, trying to suck some sort of nutrition out of them. And these were the bones of men they had known, of men they were friends with, shipmates with. The two remaining survivors were at opposite corners of the boat, clutching their bones in their own mad world, independent of each other, crazed with starvation, crazed with salt, with being lost, with despair, with hopelessness, with thirst. When suddenly they heard the sound of sails and shouting, snapping them out of this horrible nightmare. Early on February 23rd, the crew of a ship named the Dolphin found a boat floating in the ocean with these two crazed men and a bunch of bones at the bottom. And as they tried to rescue them, the men wouldn't let their bones go. These men also, obviously, too weak to make it on board the ship. Men from the Dolphin had to go down into the boat and bring them up. So these men survived. Some of them whole, some of them crazed. But it was a fraction of the crew. I think it was 8 men in total, out of 20. And as far as I know, if you want to see that piece of string that made it through this voyage, you can go to the Nantucket Museum and see it framed